Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this conversation about the school experiences of transgender and gender nonconforming youth. I'm Kim Westheimer. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Gender Spectrum. And before I introduce our guests, for those of you who aren't familiar with Gender Spectrum, I want to tell you just a little bit about us and who we are. So Gender Spectrum is a national organization based in the Bay Area with the mission of providing gender-inclusive spaces for children and youth. We do that through a variety of means, through providing training, resources, a website full of information, the Gender Spectrum Lounge, which I'm going to speak about in a little bit more. And we also have an annual conference in July, coming up this July, and a lot of other things we do to try to create gender-inclusive spaces across the board. I want to now move to our main event. We're very happy to have with us here today Maurice Gattis and Sara McKinnon. They are both assistant professors at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. Maurice teaches at the Social Work School, and Sara teaches Communication Arts. And we've done some work in the Madison area and been very pleased to partner with Maurice in the past, and we're really happy to have Sara with us on this Google Hangout. What we're going to do to start is have a 20-minute recording that will provide an overview of the research that Maurice and Sara have done. And after we watch that clip, then we're going to have time for you to ask questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Maurice Gattis.
Hi, I'm Sara McKinnon.
And we'd like to spend some time with you and share the results of a study that we did regarding transgender youth experiences in schools in Wisconsin. So in terms of, we really were interested in finding out in youth's own words what their school experiences were, because there are a few studies that look at experiences of transgender and gender nonconforming students in schools. There is currently a national study, the National Transgender Discrimination Study, and that data suggests that it's a large national study of about 6,450 people, and it suggests that approximately 78% of those expressing a transgender or gender nonconforming identity were harassed, and approximately 35% were physically assaulted, and approximately 12% were experiencing sexual violence. And in addition to that, there was sort of an intersectional analysis that found that these experiences were also associated with race and gender identity. So, for example, students of color experienced greater harassment and violence, and male to female students reported higher rates of violence, while female to male students reported higher rates of harassment. So that does show that there are some differences based on gender identity and expression. Also, in addition to these findings around the harassment and violence, in addition, this was not just reported by students. So school staff were also perpetrators of this. 31% of the students reported being harassed or bullied by a teacher or a staff member, and about 5% were physically assaulted, and 3% reported being sexually assaulted by a teacher or staff member. And then when we thought about a little more locally Wisconsin related, there's one existing data set from the 2012 Dane County Youth Assessment Survey, and this data really sort of aligns with the national data, and showing that transgender and gender nonconforming students more likely to experience poverty, food instability, homelessness compared to their cisgender peers, and also less likely to have parental protective factors and other social support outside of school. And also they were significantly more likely to report being harassed or bullied by their peers. There's a new data set out from the Dane County Youth Assessment that is currently being analyzed, and we anticipate by having additional findings soon.
So we began to work on this study in 2012 when GSAFE of Wisconsin came to Maurice and I and a number of other colleagues on campus to talk about the possibility of doing some research about transgender and gender nonconforming youth's experiences in schools. One of the things that we know from the data is that there have been a number of studies that look at the experiences of LGBT youth, but the research that focuses on trans youth specifically is quite limited. And so in developing policy, they really were seeing a gap in the knowledge and the literature that they had to use in developing policy. And so so they came to us and we began to work with GSAFE to recruit participants. We developed a study that used focus groups, and these focus groups began to be conducted in 5 cities throughout the state of Wisconsin with trans youth, age ranges 16 to 24, I believe. Is that correct? Or was it 14 to 24? 16 to 24, that's right. And we talked a little bit about, we talked for a while about what would be the most appropriate method to use for this sort of study. So we thought about surveys, we thought about interviews, and we decided upon focus groups as a good method to use for this particular topic and community. And in particular, focus groups allow for synergy of conversation. So one person talks about an experience they had, which leads another person to make connections to similar experiences. So we were really very much interested in this synergistic dynamic that plays out in focus groups. And studies show that focus groups are really good methods to use for marginalized communities, because so often what happens when we have marginalized experiences is that we don't talk about things. And so it can develop kind of tacit, hidden experiences. And so this is a great method to get at some of those dynamics that might be playing out. And so primarily our questions involved socio-demographic questions. So we asked participants about who they are, what their identities are. We also talked about questions of family, questions of being out, questions about how safe school was and the climate at their schools. We asked questions about how much students felt they could participate in their school life. So this involved things like doing activities outside of the regular school hours, how involved they felt in school life. And then we also talked about dynamics with administration and teachers, so some of the adults that exist in schools, to really get at some of the questions that Maurice raised in the existing knowledge. And finally, we talked about questions of discipline, academic achievement, and health. And so this was the range of questions that we asked participants. We analyzed the data first using open coding. So this is a method of reading through the transcripts and really looking for the themes that emerge, really allowing the participants' stories and narratives and words to drive what themes came out from the data. We began with basic descriptive codes, and then those moved to more theoretical codes. And then we really were looking to find relationships. So we began to ask questions about how particular themes relate to each other. And in total, we had 21 participants in these focus groups. Again, these students were from Green Bay, Madison, Milwaukee, and Racine. And in later studies, we've done interviews with rural trans youth in the state. And so that is beginning to be developed and kind of augmenting of the material that we've been working on.
Also, we want to ensure that the youth were able to have a full range of identities, and we also want to have a diverse range of gender expressions. So we had students self-identify, and as you can see the breakdowns, we had 1 agender, 4 female, 1 gender neutral, 1 gender fluid, 2 gender queer, 3 male, 2 transgender M to F, 1 transgender F to M, and 6 not identified. So you can see that we had a range, and that sort of mirrors the national data where there's a broad range of gender identities. We also want to look at including socioeconomic status as a marker to see how this may impact students as well. And so we decide to include whether or not students have received free or reduced lunch, sort of as a proxy in some ways to look at socioeconomic status as well. We also want to ensure racial diversity, so there was the geographic diversity, and this portion of the study really does look at the urban areas that Sara mentioned, and we also had a broad range of race, so we want to ensure racial diversity, and we had 1 Native American, 3 African American, 1 Asian, 7 white, 3 multiracial, and then on the ethnicity question, 3 Hispanic, 1 Creole, 12 non-Hispanic, and 6 not identified as well.
So now what we're going to do is turn to talk a little bit about what we found in looking at this data and speaking with the youth about their experiences in schools. And one of our primary findings was that students discussed a range of ways in which their identity or expression propels disruption in their ability to learn in school. And so what I want to do is read a quotation from one of the participants, and then I want to unpack a little bit about what this demonstrates. So Amari from Milwaukee explained a disruptive learning environment as this: an experience of my principal pulled me out of class. I was in the middle of a quiz and I'm like, why am I going to your office? And I was so shocked, and on my way back to class I actually cried. And just, it hurt me for him to say, you should just stop transitioning. And he's like, because your friends are getting uncomfortable. And I was like, well, if they're uncomfortable, they can come and tell me, and they're really not my friends to begin with, and I'm not going to stop transitioning. And I went to prom somewhere else. What this demonstrates is that Amari's identity in the midst of a quiz caused so much problem for administration, so much nervousness for administration, that it then prompted the administration to disrupt Amari's ability to learn. And we found this to be, this is an example that we found to be playing out across the board with the participants that we spoke with. Another discussion that was very prominent was the range of interactions and navigations that trans and gender nonconforming youth have to do in relation to physical facilities. So Austin describes the physical facilities in this way. In middle school, I completely avoided using the bathroom at all times, because it was like, well, the nurse's office bathroom, and I'm not going to do that. That's a lot of work. And the girls' bathroom, already been yelled at for being in there. Being the wrong gender in that bathroom, boys' bathroom, never tried using it because of the safety. It's not safe, and I know it's not safe. And so here we see this dynamic of having to do a lot of mental processing about what is the space, the physical facility that will be affirming and safe. And this is just not a sort of navigation that cis participants, cis students probably have to navigate. And so these physical facilities were things like bathrooms and locker rooms, but participants also spoke about hallways and lunchrooms as spaces that they have to navigate, where questions of safety and acceptance and affirmation are on their minds.
Yes, and regarding the safety in the locker rooms and bathroom facilities, students really did talk about how this does have impact for health. Some students avoided going to the bathroom. We know that has health consequences. Some reported taking sodium tablets so that they would not have to use the bathroom. So this also has implications for health. And regarding health and wellness, another quote that emerged was the idea that in our health teacher also, we have some conversations about, but I literally had to teach the class for her on gender and sexuality. She was kind of willing to learn, but I was scared to let her do the information because she was uneducated on it. So again, if we think about the idea of minority stress, and this is, again, another unique experience that only trans and gender nonconforming students have, which is not seeing themselves in the curriculum, in the health curriculum. And this theme we sort of talked about as subject as expert, and really relying on the student who is gender nonconforming or transgender to really be the expert in the area and to provide information for the people who are responsible for teaching as well as to the class. And as we know, when there isn't a lot of information out there as it is for the health of transgender students and transgender individuals, we also know that this may lead to misinformation that may be happening, particularly when the subject who doesn't have much information about themselves readily available may be teaching a course or educating people on it, so it may lead to misinformation as well. So that does have a particular and unique implications. Also, really, when talking about experiencing difficulties, the idea of institutional and social support really did emerge as something that was a positive influence. And there were positive interactions with social support, feeling like there was a key person in their life that they could work with, or a particular organization that they could participate in, really had a positive impact for the students involved in these situations. And they also mentioned that there sometimes was a disconnect between what a particular teacher or individual was doing that was advocating and affirming compared to what other individuals at the school were doing or institutional policy. So there was wide variation, and sometimes it was based on individual staff and teachers. Sometimes it was mandates from principals. But one of the real important themes was that institutional social support were very affirming and had positive outcomes, and that be from parents, friends, teachers, all the way up to the institution. So that's a very important piece, that support really matters.
One of the themes that really ran throughout the data that we looked at is a question of acceptance and respect. Participants really spoke about what it would mean to have a school environment that was an accepting space where they felt affirmed in their gender identity and expression and felt like they could move throughout school as they are. And as well, participants also spoke about the challenges to that. So the lack of acceptance and respect that they experience on a daily basis. Angel was one of the participants who spoke about this and said, sometimes you get to the point where you don't want to explain your pronouns or whatever. I feel like I'm sacrificing something or myself, or not respecting myself wholly, diminishing myself just by using he, because I don't like that. Just like I don't like the sound, I'm gender neutral, you know what I mean? And so this repetition of having to do these navigations was really something that participants spoke about, and it became kind of this repetitive, this constant navigation that also impacted how the students felt respected, both internally but also amongst peers and teachers in the school. And then finally, in terms of the results, safety was a key issue. And certainly physical safety is something that came up in our study. There were many spaces in school where participants spoke about feeling unsafe. And certainly bathrooms and locker rooms were some of those key spaces. And participants also spoke about how they protected themselves, how they made themselves feel safer. And there were a range of both kind of typical ways one might do that, but also very creative ways of maintaining safety. One participant spoke about the idea of, I made myself big, right? I got bigger as a mode of maintaining safety. In line with a lot of the literature about bullying and youth today in relation to media, we found that virtual world, so the digital world, the world outside of school that happens on cell phones and over computers, was a space where students spoke about feeling concerns regarding safety. And this is because the questions about safety that are present in the school then blur into one's life outside of the school. And so that can just make the weight of this feeling of precariousness and safety feel that much more. And so participants spoke about awareness of that, how they were very much aware that this social media could be a space that was difficult to navigate, and so many spoke about ways of that they literally avoided using particular forms of social media because they knew that might increase feelings of vulnerability and safety concerns.
Now, also in the presence of some of the findings that Sara and I discussed, in addition to the methodology, we also recognize there are a lot of questions that still remain unanswered, and there are some limits to what we have done, and we think it's very important to contextualize that. So in this study, there were no students enrolled in the elementary school sample. So these were students who were not K-12, the way in which the national data looks. And at the same time, we are currently working on a book. It's under contract with Columbia University Press. And the larger study did look at, we had focus groups with parents of students, some of which were in elementary school, so we are able to address some of these concerns, and we'll understand some of these unique challenges as well. And also we recognize that the students in this study were affiliated with GSAFE. So in some ways it was a self-selected group who may already have a built-in social support and network. And we recognize there are students who don't have this sort of affiliation, and that also may have an important implications for the ways in which these findings can be interpreted, and the experiences may have something to do with the fact that GSAFE was an integral part of the recruitment process. And in terms of what this means thinking around policies, right? So we think about, we had the discussion around bathrooms and locker rooms. We know that there are policies, statewide policies that are being debated around bathroom and locker room access. And in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Interscholastic Athletic Association came up with a policy around locker rooms for transgender and gender nonconforming youth. So the policies implications to look at fully integrating for the health and safety of transgender youth is important to think about at state levels, at school district levels, and at the individual school level. Also thinking about training and support for school staff and personnel, understanding some of the unique concerns and challenges that transgender and gender nonconforming students are facing. That can include looking at records and how names are used on attendance sheets, and just raising sort of awareness around and recognition around the existence of transgender and gender nonconforming students, and thinking about ways of affirming and allowing full and complete participation in school settings. Also, as mentioned, this was a G-SAFE recruited sample, so the affirmation school affirming organizations do matter and do seem to play a role. So the continued integration and support of organizations like G-SAFE and others may be an important intervention to think about inclusion for transgender students. Also, the finding regarding the health and the lack of health in the curriculum and having the subject as an expert speaks to a larger piece of there not being much community education around transgender and gender nonconforming youth at large. So really having more community discussions, more community resources, more continuing education opportunities to discuss and work with issues concerning working with gender nonconforming and transgender students. And also thinking about inclusive health curriculums that do involve the range of gender that is expressed and the range of sexuality that is expressed, to help affirm and be inclusive of transgender and gender nonconforming youth in schools.
So this is basically our study. It's available if you would like to look at a community report. It's available on the G-SAFE website. It's also available on my website, and I'm sure Maurice's as well. Thank you so much, and we look forward to your questions and comments and discussion about this project.
So what I'd like to do now, before we take some of your questions, before we take some of your questions, I want to again, first of all, thank Maurice and Sara for a wonderful presentation and just for doing the research itself, because I think it's so important to, I know it wasn't a large sample, but to hear directly some of these stories that, that young people are experiencing and what they identify as what's most important to them is really critical. And I think it's especially important for educators and people who work with young people to not just see the numbers, but to hear this is really what youth are experiencing, and this is what happens if somebody gets pulled out of a classroom to you know, for any reason that might be controversial, but particularly to say who you are, who your identity is not okay. That's going to derail a person not only for that day, but days to come. And again, the emphasis that you put on policy and training and education are very critical. And some of the resources, again, I want to highlight that are on the in our what's called the showcase are both some of our resources as well, gender spectrum resources, as well as a link to the copy of the full report. So if you can just, when you click on that, you'll see the full report. I also want to mention again the Gender Spectrum Lounge if you're looking for ways to have more dialogue about this. And we have groups there for educators, for parents, for young people. There's a group for non-binary youth, a group for youth of color who identify as genderqueer, gender expansive youth. There's a lot of different groups there where people can find support and resources if they're not in an area with an organization like G-SAFE. And again, just for folks who might not know, G-SAFE is an organization in Madison, a community LGBTQ support group that does wonderful work in actually throughout Wisconsin, not just in Madison. Mm-hmm. So now what I'd like to do is open up for some questions. And I'm just looking here. Again, I apologize for some of the technical glitches here. I'm just looking to see if I can see the chat function so I can see your questions. And okay, so here's the first question. You said that, you mentioned that you did some interviews with parents as well, and I realize that's not part of the report. And the question is, though, are there things that you learned from parents that you could share with us that might be relevant?
Yes,
Yeah.
sure.
You want to
Yes.
start?
I can start. Go ahead. Thanks for the question. Yes, we have looked at the parent data, and one of the questions that emerged involved helping their youth navigate systems in the school. So in some cases, there were existing policies in place, for example, around bathrooms and locker rooms, but there was a disconnect between the school administrator at a particular location knowing that the policy existed, and then the disconnect between that and how it was infused throughout the faculty, and whether or not the whole school had been trained on the policy and whether there was awareness around the policy. So part of it is understanding that there are policies in place, and then identifying that, making people aware, and the challenges sometimes of navigating the disconnect between administrative staff support and the policy that exists perhaps at a state level. So that was a piece that was a challenge that emerged for some of the parents that we talked to.
And one of the other things that I saw a lot in that data was, oh, sorry, that's on my end, a discussion of just how nervous it was for parents to have children that were transitioning from elementary school to middle school to high school, or maybe from different school systems, and the anxiety that was produced from having to navigate those conversations all over again with administrators. And so that really came up a lot. Nervousness about what is it going to be like when my kid goes to middle school or goes to high school, and what are the dynamics there that maybe we don't experience in elementary school, for example. And so one of the things that I really appreciated a lot about the parents' discussion was the constancy of these questions and conversations and negotiations that a parent and a child has to have with administrators.
Exactly. In addition to that, the constancy and consistency, navigating sometimes the embarrassing situations that parents would want to protect their children from, but in fact their children would also be embarrassed, and the parents may be as well. An incident that comes to mind from the data is regarding the yearbook, and the idea of the legal name through the school policy being posted in the yearbook, and the child's preferred name was not, and therefore the child was outed. So just that constantly navigating and negotiating through different venues, i.e. the yearbook or an attendance sheet in the classroom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And again, that points to so much to the need for training to avoid those kinds of situations, and to really mitigate the stress that young people feel in those situations, understandable high levels of stress.
That's right.
Thanks. I do want to remind folks that if you want to ask questions on the left side, if you just drag your mouse to the left, you'll see there's a little blue icon for chat, and if you put a question in there, we can ask your questions. But I got to move on to another question now. A lot of times we hear people talking about young people, and young people being more accepting than adults in general around transgender and gender expansive youth. And at the same time, we still hear the stories of harassment and bullying that you described. And I'm wondering if, in your experience, the young people who you interviewed felt like the folks who were harassing and bullying them, were they an exception among their peers within the schools, or were they more the rule? I guess it's that question of, is it just a few kids who are making life really miserable, or is it much larger than that from what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, so I think misgendering was pervasive in the conversations that the youth had with us, that they felt like, you know, kind of across the board, whether it was administrators or youth, that there was a constancy to the misgendering, but they made a distinction between, in some ways, a distinction between harassment and bullying in a severe way that we think about, and misgendering. And so I think that was interesting to see those tensions really come out. But both of those experiences, whether it's like physical fear and a fear of harassment and bullying, or misgendering, both of those weigh heavily on trans youth. Both of those impact one's ability to
learn in a way that's not disruptive. So I think we need to be thinking about both of those and developing policies and programs and training and discussion around both of those things. But the youth also talked about having friends in their corner, right? So that was also a part of this, that there was this sense that their cohort, their peers, got it a lot better and were more, able to be fluid with getting it than some of the school administrators and teachers. And so, yeah, I think that generational dynamics are important to discuss.
Yes, I would echo that. In addition to thinking about, the study wasn't really designed to quantify the number of instances or incidents that this occurred. I would echo Sarah that it is important that it was occurring at multiple levels, so administrators, staff, students, and across generations there were supportive principals and administrators, and there were supportive teachers and staff, there were supportive and unsupportive parents, as well as supportive and unsupportive students. So we couldn't quite quantify that piece. And it's also interesting to think about, so the youth talked about social support. When it worked, so having peer support. But I also think of an instance from the data that suggested that some youth perceive that misgendering could be used as a tool to hurt. So they had supportive friends who would use their preferred pronouns consistently, parents who would consistently, but they perceived that perhaps an instance of a friend being mad with them, then misgendering sort of on purpose to use that as a tool to hurt. So that occurred even among peers who were supportive within that generation. So it's important to think about even that sort of names, pronouns, and gendering, how that can be used supportively, and how it was in some instances used as a tool or a perceived tool of sort of a way to hurt someone.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I want to also just say that the second time when I gave instructions about asking questions, I didn't give the correct instructions, so I'm going to just work on my time. It's just one of those days here in the virtual world. So
it's always one of those days for me.
To ask questions, what you need to do is click on the cluster of squares in the top right part of your screen. When you click on that, you'll be able to move back and forth from the Q&A function and the showcase function. And the showcase function is where we have the documents that you can look at related to the talk. But meanwhile, we'll keep going on. Another question is, one second here. Okay. Make sure that's working. You mentioned that one of the limitations of the study, or one of the ways maybe the study was skewed a bit, is that the youth who you interviewed were all connected with GSAFE as a community support organization. And I'm wondering if those young people talked at all about peers of theirs who aren't involved in organizations like that, and were able to talk about why they think some of their friends might not be involved in organizations like that and what their experiences are.
Right, that's a good question. So none of the youth really talked about the parallels of what it would mean to not be involved in GSAFE. They talked about the importance of it, but they didn't talk about people who weren't involved in GSAFE and what that meant. But there is empirical literature sort of nationally and some other regional studies that do look at GSAFE, and some people find that GSAFE is a space where they are uncomfortable. And sometimes GSAFEs are targeted, and so some people find discomfort as well. So there is some mixed evidence on that. But not to directly address your question, a piece that did emerge from our findings around GSAFE, we talk about it as being protective and the support. There were instances of a theme that emerged that was called sort of pretend allies or false allies. So some of the youth in the study would go into GSAFEs that were safe for LGB people, but were not comfortable on the transgender issue. So sometimes GSAFE advisors at schools actually were uncomfortable and not qualified to work on transgender issues. So it wasn't always necessarily a supportive tool. So that was a bit of nuance. Doesn't directly answer your question, but I do want to tease it out a little bit more.
And it does really address the question about why some young people might not want to be part of that group. And just to clarify, when I think about GSAFE, I think about the statewide organization. But you're saying there's chapters similar to GSAs and individual.
Yes, that's exactly right.
I actually didn't understand that till right now. So it's like thinking about a GSA, and in some schools a GSA is going to be more supportive, and some schools less supportive. And what you're saying is that really makes a difference. And so I think that's a really important point, because sometimes there's an assumption made that if there's a GSA in a school, that folks involved in the GSA are educated around gender, and particularly around transgender students and the dimensions of gender and such, and we really shouldn't assume that. And that the need for education is not just education of adults, but also education of the student body and even of organizations like GSAs.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it was really the advice. I mean, the students in the study talked about when there was an advisor of the GSA that wasn't supportive, it made it really challenging to find that as a space that was supportive. That was significant.
It was. And also thinking about the idea of the localized chapters, and thinking about intersectionally, trans youth of color would perhaps think of GSAFE as a space for the affirmation of their gender identity, but may have been a source of racism.
Yeah.
Right? So there are additional layers of complexity that emerge with trans youth of color, understanding the differences between the GSA chapters.
And did you find a variation in the chapters in terms of how racially diverse they were? Were some more racially diverse than others, or was it pretty consistent across the board?
So we weren't, the sample didn't draw specifically from this GSA and this GSA and this GSA. When we were doing recruiting, it was rather recruiting kind of from Milwaukee area more generally. So there could have been many GSAs that students were coming from and to participate in our studies. So the study didn't take place at a school during school hours. And so it makes it really challenging to make an assessment of specific GSAs or how GSAs are operating, just because the students were coming from all over the place. Even in the same focus group, they would be from multiple school districts.
Exactly. That's a very good point. It wasn't designed that. And to address some of the limitations that we did want to think about variation, even though we couldn't think about individual chapters, which is why today's video didn't talk about it. But the study, we also interviewed rural youth from different rural areas of Wisconsin. So we have an urban, rural, that's why we wanted racial variation, socioeconomic variation as judged by free and reduced lunch, so that we could at least think about different experiences, although they're not completely generalizable, but we could at least think about what different experiences may look like, not necessarily drilled down to the individual GSA, but that there are going to be differential experiences, perhaps based on geographic region or race, or perhaps social class, or rural versus urban.
Great. And you talk very clearly about the importance of allies, and I'm thinking for any educators who might be listening to this right now, I have a couple questions. One is for youth, did they talk at all about how they identified a teacher as an ally? What specifically did adults do that helped youth realize, oh, this is somebody I can actually be safe with, or this is someone I can go to?
I mean, it was really simple stuff. Yes, so they did talk about that. I mean, sometimes it was as simple as stickers on the outside of one's door, indicating I'm an ally, I'm here, but a lot of it was just addressing the questions that would matter if you were trans and gender nonconforming. So what's your preferred name and pronouns? Like that simple question, that series of simple questions was, I think, a huge indicator for the students in our study about who is an ally and who's not, who may not be an ally, or who doesn't know how to be an ally and could be an ally. So I think it's really some of these really simple gestures, and then also not positioning student as expert all of the time. That was one of the things we saw in the study, that when conversations about trans or even just LGBT issues would come up, the student would be turned to as, you're the expert, teach us on this subject. And that was really uncomfortable for the student in that situation to be put on the spot in that way. Perhaps hadn't had conversations with their peers, and so this was just a really challenging moment. So that simple question of asking, what's your preferred name and pronouns, did a lot of work. And students, one adult ally in a school did so much in the kids' lives. It really made the difference, whether it was a teacher or a counselor. These are important figures in kids' lives, and so that's not to be undervalued. That's really significant.
Absolutely, and the informal mechanisms that Sara mentioned about identifying people who were supportive by asking about pronouns, and having a affirming experience informally. And then also additionally having the sort of professional who was in a position such as a guidance counselor or a social worker that's supposed to be identified as someone to help navigate student success in a more official role. That worked mixed results, but that was also a starting place for a lot of parents and sometimes youth as well. So having the clearly identified role, in addition to these very important informal allies that people were able to identify because they had affirming experiences or demonstrated without being sort of proactively asking what are students' preferred pronouns to all students at the very beginning, without reacting to, oh, we have a student perhaps who is gender nonconforming or trans, and now we're going to ask that particular student. So demonstrating that up front let students know this person is understanding that people are on a spectrum and are allowing for that space on day one, regardless of singling out people or reacting to a particular instance.
That's great. And here's another question that came in. We hear a lot about resilience these days. Do you think that it's that's a concept that's relevant to the young people that you interviewed? And if so, how did you see that manifested?
Yes, so I think that's an important concept that we talk about. And I think of the example that we saw in the presentation about the student who was pulled out of class and sort of told to stop transitioning, and they said, and still I went to the prom somewhere else, right? And so that idea of I went through this really humiliating, minority stress inducing, singled out for gender identity, traumatic experience, right, that also has an impact on academic education, and still saying, but I went to the prom somewhere else. So I still had an affirming experience. Also thinking about students talk about their future and what future orientation I want to go to college. I'm going to transition successfully and become a writer and become an author. So yes, students did talk about resilience as well, and I think that's an important concept. And I think in some ways it's kind of an interesting conversation that we're having, because some people discuss the idea of over-reliance on resilience, that we celebrate youth's resiliency, and that may be to the detriment of intervening on the actual discrimination and the stigma and the instances of trauma or violence or microaggressions that are happening. So it's the duality of increasing resilience and celebrating resilience, which the youth are, and that is a big part of the study, but also recognizing that we want to prevent the behaviors and maybe not rely on, and they're resilient.
That's right.
Look how strong they are, which is true, and they are, but also let's prevent them from having to be strong and resilient on these negative traumatic experiences that are unique to trans and gender nonconforming students, and that we can intervene and do something about.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And here's a question from Emma that says, I don't know the culture of areas of Wisconsin very well. I live in a community that considers itself pretty liberal, but our students still experience challenging school environments. I'm just curious in order to assess the students' experience in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like Madison would be probably a parallel to this this questioner's experiences of where they live. But some of the other locations where we did focus groups and did interviews with rural trans youth are do not exist in that sort of liberal liberal space. Probably like Racine, for example, I think is really important. We did a focus group there, and that's been a site of a lot of question and discussion around trans harassment in schools, and certainly in the northern rural areas of Wisconsin. And so that was really one of the things we were trying to get at, is a diversity of geographical, class, racial dimension, so we could understand a little bit better what youth might be experiencing differently. I mean, for example, in Madison, the school district has an LGBT coordinator, yes, right? And so that makes a big difference when there's someone whose job it is in the districts to be developing programs, to be talking with teachers and administrators. And you actually, when you look at the comparison of the Madison focus group to some of the other focus groups, there's a difference in the ways that the youth are talking about. For me, it's mostly in the language that they're using, that there's a language around acceptance and respect and all sorts of things that which I just didn't necessarily see as present in some of the other focus groups. And that's not to say that there's not their own language that's being developed in those spaces. But yeah, I think that matters. Geography definitely plays out in what some of these moments look like. But it doesn't discount that the Madison youth were still experiencing significant challenges with safety and ability to have access to the things that made learning most possible. And so I think that it goes both ways.
Exactly, and that was while a limitation that everyone involved was with GSAFE. One of the strengths is that GSAFE is a statewide organization, right? So it is Madison-based, but it does have reach throughout the state. So we're able to look at the deep experiences. And Wisconsin's a state does not have very many large cities, right? The four that you saw, Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Racine, are close to the four largest cities, right? So we're not talking large metropolitan areas. But we did want to get at the variety of experiences. And it is important, that's an important question, it is important to note that Madison does have an LGBTQ social worker for the district, and the other school districts don't. And that does shape the experience, but to Sara's, the nuances still did emerge and manifest themselves with challenges and strengths, right? There were, there was a rural youth interview where a lot of it was very positive, right? Looking for the negative, looking for what are the challenges, and it's like, no, it's fine, it's good, like I'm respected, I get my pronouns, and so, yes.
I think that's always so important to be able to see where people can find support in places that we might think, based on our biases, might be unlikely places. So that's great. Another question here from Tessa saying, thanks for sharing this important results. Based on your work, what's the most important thing you think a teacher or administrator can do to make sure that transgender students are safe in school?
Great question.
I mean, I think one of the things we did focus groups with professionals in schools, and that was also really great because one of the things we saw was the barriers that teachers and administrators face in implementing policies and training programs. But one of the things I saw that was super successful, and I thought, wow, this should be implemented widely, is to do sort of an assessment. So when a youth comes out as trans, identifies as trans, it then implemented a set of processes, and the youth had basically it wasn't a guidance counselor, but sort of a guidance counselor that worked with them one-on-one to make sure registration things changed, to make sure that teachers knew in the ways that was necessary and appropriate. And it just, the system in this school did a lot of the work for the parent and the child, and I just thought, yes, that's exactly what should happen. It was a few steps that really made a significant difference, and so I thought that was a really beautiful moment of thinking about how we can use structure to really make significant impacts in people's lives.
I think that's a very important point, yes, and it's difficult for me to think of the singular most important thing, but I guess the singular most important thing would be one thing packaged in many ways, and that the intervention, the way in which we can think about creating safe spaces, targets multiple levels, thinking about the community, right, and letting community drive it, but it is thinking about policies that impact people, it is thinking about peers, it is thinking about the adults in the community, it is thinking about the school staff, because the youth exists in a wide variety of settings, right, and so navigating that would require sort of an approach that addresses all these multiple systems, because even some of the youth, we didn't really talk about it because we focused on schools, but talked about when I go to work, my name tag is incorrect, right? And so again, when you're having this intervention or thinking about improving lives, that's a community education piece, right? So the people where you're working, you go to school, but you also go to work, have also heard about issues and have been sensitized. So it gets multi-generational, it gets at policies that protect people, it gets at youth, it gets at adults. And so I think that would be singularly important, that it is sort of comprehensive.
Great. And we have one more question before we wrap up. And this is from Bradley, who asks, what are the questions that you would like to explore next? After doing this research, what are the areas that you would like to see additionally researched?
I think, so for me, I think more needs to be done on the policy recommendations. That's something that Maurice and I are working on a lot right now, is to say, okay, we have all of this data and this analysis, it's great. So what should we be recommending to schools? And so that is on my mind a lot as I think about really practical suggestions that can make significant differences in students' lives. That's one thing I would say. I also think the rural aspect is important, and that's one thing I've been most excited about our study, is it gets at questions. A lot of what the data on trans youth, where it comes from is the coast, and so we in the Midwest, we're in a unique position to maybe speak to experiences that don't come from those coasts, and so that's really exciting, and I'm excited to engage with that a little bit further, asking those questions about rurality.
Right, that Sara mentioned, that's the analysis we're doing for the book right now. And also, next sort of ongoing steps currently is that we're working with school districts through GSAFE. Sara's really taking the lead on this portion, thinking about following schools that are actually implementing policies and actually training districts to find out what are those concrete next steps, like the task, what are your meetings, what are the content of the meetings, who's doing the training,
yeah.
Is it a mandated training, is it not a mandated training, to really follow the implementation now that the districts have decided, yes, we're going to have a policy that's in place to protect gender expansive youth. What does it actually look like? So some of it will be mundane, one-on-one meetings. This is what was said, this is how it happened. Others will be following the content of the training. But to really, so that if someone asks us a question, what should we do? We can give you sort of, well, this is what one district did step by step. It may not be how your community would do it, but this is what happened. And in some ways, these are the outcomes that happened as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I want to just say, in terms of policies, I want to highlight a few things. One is that, again, in the area on the website where you can see documents, we've uploaded a sample policy from the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network just to look at that. But I also want to mention some other states and districts that have really solid policies that folks might want to look at if they're interested in that. So actually Madison, Wisconsin is one that I often highlight as a wonderful policy around transgender youth. Also, just a couple of others. Washington, D.C. in the last year came out with a very comprehensive policy. The state of Massachusetts, the state of Washington. There are, I believe, 14 states right now that have inclusive policies on the state level, and more districts are putting in inclusive policies. So just that there's an opportunity out there for folks who want to know what the wording looks like, what good wording is for policy. There are lots of places to go to find that, and I love the idea of doing research to see how's it actually implemented and what's the impact. So I think that's a wonderful idea. So at this point, I want to just thank the two of you again for taking your time, for doing this research, for your commitment to youth, really. And I know we'll be having further conversations. And thanks to all of you who joined this talk. And thanks for putting up with some of our technical difficulties. And if you want to continue this conversation at all, join the Gender Spectrum Lounge. There is a subgroup on the lounge around research and youth, research, gender, and youth. And if you join that, it'll be an opportunity to continue this conversation there. If you have questions or follow-up, then we can engage both Sara and Maurice on that as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.